Howard Sternwater.
All right, we'll go to Rick from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Washington
Rick,
Journal airs live every morning at 7 Eastern here on C-SPAN. The House is coming in now for a couple of votes on measures debated earlier.
Undergoing a problem.
Res 44 by the yeas and nays. The first electronic vote will be conducted as a 15-minute vote. Remaining electronic votes will be conducted as 5-minute votes. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion from the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Meehan, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1542, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1542, a bill to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to establish weapons of mass destruction, intelligence, and information sharing functions of the Office of Intelligence and Analysts of the Department of Homeland Security, and to require dissemination of information analyzed by the Department to entities with responsibilities relating to Homeland Security and for other purposes.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.
Members voting now on a bill that aims to ensure that information on weapons of mass destruction is coordinated between agencies and shared with appropriate stakeholders. Later this week, the House will debate 2014 Defense Department spending. The House Rules Committee is meeting right now to decide what amendments, if any, will be allowed on the bill. The Hill writes that a group of 11 conservative organizations is calling on Speaker John Boehner to keep the Defense Appropriations Bill open to all amendments when it hits the floor. House Republican leaders are considering limiting amendments because they're concerned about proposals to curtail President Obama's options in Syria and Egypt or attempts to defund the National Security Agency's surveillance programs. In a letter to Speaker Boehner today, the fiscal conservative groups, led by Taxpayers for Common Sense, said that restricting amendments would break with Boehner's pledge to follow regular order and allow open debate. Again, the Rules Committee is meeting right now on what amendments, if any, are allowed on the bill. Here's more about the Pentagon spending legislation. Government funded in fiscal 2014. What's coming up this week?
Well, the big show on defense will be defense appropriations in the House, where a $512 billion bill reaches the floor. The issue in the House, though, is how do you bring it there, and how do you get the rule, in other words, the floor procedures set up so that they can actually vote on the bill. And that's been the problem for the last week on this particular bill, as both Republicans and Democrats have raised issues of the National Security Agency spying program, along with some funding and to Syria and Egypt and activities tied to those two countries. And they want to talk about that on the House floor before any passage. Well, House Republican leaders want to limit that. They give us a couple of reasons. They say that there are some classified things that they are worried might creep up in those discussions on the floor in public. In reality, they also are very concerned that some of the programs they don't want cut could become victim to a combination of libertarian Republicans on their side and liberal Democrats on the other.
In your story, you write that there are just 17 legislative days left before the new fiscal year begins. So how's the work going on the dozen spending bills that are supposed to keep the government operating past September 30th?
Well, very slow, and of course they have until the September 30th end of the fiscal year before they must renew a current continuing resolution. But right now, the Senate plans to take up its first of 12 appropriations bills this week, and the House has done 3 and looking to do 4, perhaps 5 this week. But you're right, they only have 17 scheduled legislative days. Their August recess begins at the end of next week, and they only have 9 scheduled days in September with the holidays and Labor Day and the constituent work week. So we either will see an incredible last-ditch sprint of activity, or we're going to be having to consider watching them put together a makeshift continuing resolution once again for the start of the fiscal year.
You mentioned overall spending in the defense bill. Do those levels stay under sequestration caps?
This does carry the sequestration, but in a way that would impact other bills. Of course, members on both sides of the aisle have, both privately and some publicly, suggested that defense programs should be hit a little less than perhaps social programs. Now, obviously, Democrats have a problem with, most Democrats have a problem with this, but that's the way they set up the CR last year with regards to defense funding, and that seems to be the way they're headed this year, to take a little less out of defense and take a little more from the other programs.
Later in the week, the House is planning to consider 2 bills dealing with the EPA. What are those bills about?
Those are about Republican messaging, basically. For instance, one of them would just require the EPA to do a report on any suggestion or program that would cost $1 billion or more to implement. These aren't going anywhere in the Senate, but it's a way for the House Republicans to say that they're cutting down on regulation again, or trying to, and cutting down on costs to the businesses.
Billy House is a staff correspondent for National Journal. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And again, the Rules Committee is meeting right now to determine what amendments, if any, will be allowed on the defense spending bill. Congressional Quarterly writes that House Republicans today unveiled plans for another spending bill. They plan to cut the Environmental Protection Agency's budget by 34% in 2014 and block federal rules to limit carbon emissions from power plants. And as we heard just mentioned, later this week, the House will debate other EPA-related bills. One focused on coal ash regulations, and the other bill would prevent the EPA from finalizing energy regulations that would cost more than $1 billion. House Intelligence Committee Chairman Mike Rogers said today that cyber espionage is a major threat facing the U.S. and that the country is not prepared. He spoke at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and was introduced by the group's executive director.
Well, I assume you can all hear me, even if the mics don't work. I'm introducing Mike Rogers, Congressman Mike Rogers. I'm Stephen Simon, the Executive Director of IISS US. Welcome to the IISS US. Can you hear me now? It's deafening. I'm the Executive Director at IISS US. Here I'm introducing Congressman Mike Rogers, and with a great deal of pleasure. Congressman Rogers was elected to Congress in 2000. He came to Congress from an unusual background, defense and law enforcement. He was an Army officer and an FBI special agent before coming to the U.S. Congress. He now has a very important, even pivotal role in the House as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, the House Intelligence Committee. The Intelligence Committee, as you all probably know, does the authorizing for intelligence activities and functions in an oversight capacity as well. In this respect, Congressman Rogers has done quite well shepherding 3 bills through to completion thus far, and all the while developing a reputation for bipartisanship, which in Washington nowadays is quite a rare and special thing. Congressman Rogers has now grasped the nettle of the cybersecurity issue, which has loomed very large of late, and it's an issue with which the Institute itself, IISS, is closely associated. With that, I'd like to bring Congressman Rogers to the podium. He'll speak for essentially as long as he wishes to speak, and then we'll follow up with Q&A and wrap up in an hour. Congressman.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning. Thanks. I was we ran a little behind. Somebody apparently had hacked into my GPS. Got us in. Oh, come on now. Lighten up, people. Can't do that now. I do appreciate the opportunity. Director, thank you so much for having me here. And what I think is probably the biggest national security issue that America is not quite ready to handle, and that is cybersecurity, cyber attacks, cyber espionage. You know, as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, there's a lot that keeps us all up at night. My theory is by the time I'm done this morning, if you can't sleep tonight, then we're even. That's good. That's a good thing. One of the things, if you look around the world at the troubles we're trying to deal with now, certainly an unstable Egypt and certainly uncertainty there. Syria, that seems there is no good option in Syria anymore. We're just playing for our best, worst option in the Syrian circumstance. The Russians have played a more aggressive role internationally. They've dropped in the water some very sophisticated nuclear submarines. We hadn't really seen that since the 1990s. They are aggressively playing in the world, and sometimes to the thorn of what we think is good policy in places like Syria and others when it comes to their blocking in the United Nations and other places around the world, Iran. So when you look at where the Chinese are, who are aggressively pursuing and have been increasing their defense spending 13% per year since 1989. And by the way, when people make the comparison about our military versus any other military in the world, our two biggest expenses are personnel and health care in the United States Defense Department. And other countries, China included, doesn't have that burden. So when they say 13% per year increase, that means they're buying new technology, they're getting leaner and more sophisticated in their military operations. They've aggressively talked about not having the U.S. Navy in the South China Sea, which we've been there for 238 years roughly, mainly because 40% of the world's trade goes through the South China Sea. So we've got a whole world that we look at every day. You have Al-Qaeda in the northern Maghreb, certainly Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, all things that we worry about. Loose nukes. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out that counterproliferation issue in our committee. And then that one thing that we have, we all understand those issues. They're well seated in history, and things that maybe the locations haven't changed, the problems have changed. But now on the front is cybersecurity. It's something that is really unknown in the annals of what we would understand as our normal national security framework and structure and conversation. We're going to have to change that. We're trying to change that. There's been some hiccups in us changing that particular dialogue. So you think about where we are. You have the hacktivists now, who people have political motivations, who are hacking into sites, bringing sites down, trying to make their voices heard through, I argue, illegal acts on the Internet. You have individual criminal knockoffs who are trying to get in and steal anything they can that's not nailed down and use it to their advantage. Your ID, your Social Security number, your birth date, your credit card number if they can get it, steal what they can, move on to the next victim. Organized crime on the Internet, which is a growing threat. Matter of fact, the credit card in your wallet will get hit about, the company itself will get hit about 300,000 times today for people trying to get in, mainly from Eastern Bloc organized criminals, to try to get in and steal a block of numbers in a bigger way in order to steal both personal information as well as your credit card information and turn that into a criminal profit. We have the next level up is certainly one we have talked about frequently, Chinese primarily, economic espionage, where a nation state has geared its military and intelligence services toward this single focus of stealing intellectual property, taking it back, repurposing that intellectual property, and competing illegally against both U.S., European, Asian companies of which they stole that property. Huge problem. Keith Alexander, the director of the NSA, has called it probably the largest transfer of wealth illegally in the world's history. Many believe it's pushing $2 trillion in value of lost and stolen intellectual property. So these are the blueprints of companies. They go in, they spend as much time as they need to spend. They will have these long, persistent threats. They will lay there as long as they need to find specific pieces of intellectual property to steal and bring back again for repurposing. And what we're finding is, especially, and I talk about the Chinese, other nations do it, nobody even comes close to the level and comparison as the Chinese when it comes to theft of intellectual property.
They have certain sectors of the economy of which they will identify and then pass on to their units who are designed specifically to steal that particular intellectual property. So when you get up in the morning, if you're the IT security guy for fill in the blank, could be a manufacturing sector piece, it could be a pharmaceutical or a biologic piece, it could be a military piece of hardware, it could be on a trade deal. You get that list of companies and sectors that you're supposed to target until you are successful in penetrating. If you're the IT security guy, that is an ominous list to be on, as you can imagine, right? The weight of that has got to be overwhelming, that you as an individual, small or medium or large business, is responsible for defeating a nation state in its economic espionage activities. That's why we're losing this fight, not because we don't have great IT guys, but I'll guarantee you if a nation state dedicates its intellectual capital and resources to getting into your network, eventually they're going to get in your network. That's the problem that we're facing when it comes to economic espionage. Let me give you one other bad piece of news on this. And we've seen this especially in China, where some of these very enterprising young cyber hackers who are designed and trained and employed by the Chinese government, either their military or civilian intelligence services, to steal intellectual property. They're very good. They spend their 8, 9, 10 hours a day doing their work for the Chinese government. And then they've realized if you're a company that's on that list, but you're way down the list, why not pick up the phone, call that company and say, you know what, I'm free nights and weekends. For a little cash, I'll be happy to spend my time trying to get in and get that intellectual property. So imagine this. We understand our problem set. Let's say it's 10 people, and half of those people have decided they're going to do this on the nights and weekends. They have just increased their ability towards cyber economic damage to the United States, our European allies, Asian allies as well, by 50% overnight. This is a huge problem. And the reason they think they can go there is because there has been no consequences, and I mean no consequences, to their economic espionage. It has been a free rein and a free run. And you think about that China needs to grow at 6, 7, and 8% per year just to sustain their economic social programming. They're not doing it by innovation, they're doing it by theft. And we are the victims of that. And we'll be lucky to grow at 2.5% this year. Just to meet their numbers, 7%. They're not innovating at 7%. Again, you can do the math and understand where those jobs, where that economy, where that prosperity is coming from. Places like the United States and other innovative economies around the world. Very, very dangerous stuff. So then you look at the last level that concerns us all. This is the stuff that they talked about in the beginning. Many called it the digital Pearl Harbor or other things to try to, I think, get people to understand the gravity of what lays in wait for us. And that is military style or terrorist style cyber attacks for the sole purpose of creating chaos, causing damage, punishing their enemies. And when you look at where we are today, the reason this one is so concerning is because so many nation states are now gaining in capability that we just hadn't anticipated in the past or seen in the past, and their rapid increase in their capability is concerning. Some we think is coming on their own, some because they're getting the tutelage and comfort of others, maybe even nation states who are giving them that capability. So we know that military-style planning is alive and well and will be with us as long as we have computers in our lives. That day has come and gone, and there is no turning back. The Russians, we saw use it in Estonia when Mr. Putin was apparently upset that they took down a statue of a Soviet soldier from the square, if you remember this, about 2007. And it was a devastating and just about ruinous cyber attack as a form of political punishment to the small country of Estonia. I mean, it had serious, serious consequences. We saw the Russians using it again in a military-style planning when they invaded South Ossetia. So imagine that cyber attack is the new prepping of the battlefield. Before it was airplanes dropping bombs and artillery shells landing before you'd send in your troops and your tanks. Now before any of that happens,
you're going to see a very aggressive cyber attack to be as disruptive and cause as much chaos as you possibly can. Remember, imagine in a small town, people coming and trying to get gas, can't do it, pumps won't work, grocery stores, all their cooling units gone, the electric grid is offline, you can't get cash from your banks, your financial institutions are shut down. You can imagine what chaos that causes in a very short order. And it is troubling indeed, and as I said, that's with us forevermore. There was an interesting public report called the Mandiant Report, authored by a gentleman named Kevin Mandia, who talked about much of what we knew in a classified setting for quite some time, but they were able to identify a particular unit that had both intellectual property designs, meaning they were supposed to go after certain bits of intellectual property, but also going after things like our electric grid to find that long persistent threat angle where they could get into that system. Not because I don't think the Chinese were going to turn off our electric grid, but they were just getting ready in case they ever needed it, in case they ever needed the opportunity to shut off our electric grid, which sounds a bit Orwellian, but again, alive and well. So if you know the Russians have that capability, certainly the Chinese have that capability, and it was troublesome to us that they had been so persistent about trying to find places to lay malicious source code into our electric grid, so if they ever needed it, they could shut it off. Dangerous in and of itself. So this last piece, which is concerning, is where you saw North Korea go across their border and attack both some businesses and a financial institution. And they had more success than we anticipated that they would have. So that concerns us. How did they get their capability where they got it? Now, it wasn't up to the same standards as we might see in other nation states, China, Russia, others. But it was significant, which means that they're rapidly increasing their ability to conduct mischief around the world using cyber attacks. Why is that a problem? Not necessarily a rational actor in the national economic stage, as we have seen. So they're pursuing their nuclear weapons program with vigor, and now they're pursuing a cyber warfare capability that's concerning, and we watch them use it in a way that's very concerning to their South Korean neighbors. Lastly, Iran. We have seen some very, very, very devastating efforts on behalf of Iran. One of the things, too, this caught us a little off guard on their sheer capability for a destructive attack, something called Saudi Aramco. Obviously the Saudis and the Iranians have been at each other for some time. They have some strong theological and political differences. They attacked Saudi Aramco mainly because it was the largest clearinghouse for the Saudi government when it came to oil payments and other things. So imagine leaving on a Friday, coming back to your office, and 30,000 machines, computers, are not just off, they're broken. You're not going to turn them on. You're not getting data off of them. They are paperweights on your desk. They were able to get in and something called a BIOS system and absolutely damage the system so your computer would no longer initiate for its operation. It's worthless and not likely to recover the data. It'd be pretty difficult to do on your best day. Most likely, you're never going to get any of that data off of that particular computer. Huge, huge problem. They also destroyed data, and then they manipulated data. So in other words, instead of me owing you $100 in my records, it's the other way around. And I don't know how you go back and try to untwine that. If you're imagining you're engaged in international commerce, and now all your ledger sheets, which is hard for me to say apparently, were turned around in this particular case. Very, very, very devastating. And so here's what's worrisome about that. We know that, according to public reports, the Iranians have been aggressively pursuing, we call them probing actions on our U.S. financial institutions. The sheer number of these cases targeting U.S. institutions in the United States was troubling a month ago. It's more than troubling today. And it has gone unabated. And what we found was that it is not their best work. We know that they have a capability they have not used yet in these particular type of attacks. These were a sophisticated DDoS attack, denial of a service attack. So they're trying to shut down the bank's ability to process transactions. They had some limited success in this, at least the first go-round, enough that it concerned our financial institutions. And by the way, they're probably the best at protecting themselves from these kinds of things because they've been engaged in trying to stop theft, since Dillinger decided he wanted to rob banks. And then into the digital age, people were trying to get into bank. Remember the old scheme to round off the 0.0000 of a cent and put it in an account? Remember those? Boy, whoever thought we would long for those kinds of days in bank theft in the United States. Then what they did is they were able to shut down certain banks. One particular financial institution told us that just the lost transaction time and then the mitigation to try to keep up with what their attack was cost one particular bank over $100 million. One financial institution, one attack, not their best work. That ought to make everybody sit up a little straighter. At least now you know why I don't sleep at night as the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. We have certain financial institutions in this country that transact and clear transactions on a daily basis of $8 trillion globally. Imagine if somebody is successful at causing that some problem as we move forward. It would be devastating. And here's the thing why we have to get this right. And I'll take I want to take questions so we can have a dialogue here. If people lose faith in the internet, it's 1/6 of our economy today in the United States. 1/6. Think about how much you do from shopping to banking to communication today on the internet. And it'll only get more engaged in your life, not less, most likely. But what if we lose faith in the internet as a commercial tool? 1/6 of
this vote, the yeas are 388, the nays are 3. 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Ribble, to suspend the rules and agree to H-Con Res 44, on which the yeas and nays were ordered. The clerk will report the concurrent resolution.
House Calendar Number 45, House Concurrent Resolution 44, concurrent resolution authorizing the use of the Capitol grounds for the District of Columbia Special Olympics Law Enforcement Torch Run.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to the concurrent resolution? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
The last vote of the day, but allowing the use of the Capitol grounds for the D.C. Special Olympics Law Enforcement Torch Run. And as this vote continues, more from House Intelligence Committee Chairman Mike Rogers on cyber espionage.
Share malicious source code in real time to stop this. Eventually, we are going to be on the losing end of this equation. And we can only say so often that we're the most innovative and we're ahead of everyone else, and we can just keep innovating our way past the folks who are innovating against us, places like Iran or North Korea, non-rational actors. Or we can do something that would allow the federal government to share some very sensitive malicious source code with the private sector so they can protect their own networks, not that the NSA would be monitoring those networks, and that they would share a malicious source code attack that the federal government would not see normally, so that we can react and both protect our government networks and then maybe be helpful in finding out what the origin of that particular attack was. This is as serious a problem as I have ever seen. Unfortunately, the most recent events have clouded our ability to get our arms around what's happening to us and how we actually move forward to defend ourselves and protect, I argue, the last place on earth that will have a free and open and energized internet. If we don't do this the right way, shame on us. The next generation of Americans will have a very different attitude toward the internet, and will look at it as that one open window in a very dangerous neighborhood. That is no place to be as we move forward. So with that, we can talk about anything that you would like, sir, and we'll open it up to any questions that you might have. You want me to just haul them out here?
Go
Great.
ahead.
Yep. Yes, sir.
Please tell us who you are when you ask your question.
Hello, my name is Donald Zepp. I'm from the Embassy of Estonia.
You might want to tell your story today.
First of all, thanks for being so vocal all the time about the cybersecurity issues and keeping this topic on the table. As cybersecurity or cyber in more general doesn't have any borders, there is a clear need also for international cooperation in this regard. What are your views how this can be in most efficient way? And at the same time, there has been a bit of a start to partnering with the private sector here in the States. But do you have any ideas how to include also the private sector abroad, internationally? Because besides the government-to-government or more wider international cooperation, there is a need also for cooperation with the private sector globally. Thank you.
Yes. Well, I had just kind of finished recently a series of meetings with our international partners in the EU Parliament, trying to find a way. With the disclosures of the Snowden incident, obviously it raised concerns and fears, by the way, most of which were just based on inaccurate information. So the biggest part of that was, first of all, we need to get the facts on the table, so we're making decisions based on what the facts are, not what we think is happening. And that was really important. So what we've decided to do is, matter of fact, we're going to have a small delegation from here go with the EU, and we're starting with the EU because we think that makes the most sense. It's the second most integrated internet commercial zone, if you will, in the world, and we thought that would be the next logical and appropriate place. And then they have concerns about how we partner, and we wanted to make sure we get all that worked out. The government can't do this on their own. The United States doesn't have the kill switch on the internet, and I argue we should not have the kill switch like China, like Russia, like Iran, like North Korea. And so we have to partner. The solution here isn't a government solution. It's really a partnership in sharing and other things. And we need to do that here first, we argue, and at the same time have the dialogue with first our European friends and then try to bring as many of the G20 nations, knowing that some of our biggest cyber adversaries lie into the G20 nations. But we have to start building it out. And my argument has been, we are in a cyber war today. Most Americans don't know it. They go about their lives happily, and that's a good thing, other than the fact that we are in a cyber war today. Your nation felt it, I think, first, bigger and harder than any other nation. You've made history, and it's not the history you want to make. But we're in that fight right now, every day, and we haven't protected ourselves yet. So as we go with this dialogue with our European allies, and I met with the chairman of, I think it's the Justice Committee that does all the data privacy, where we're trying to work through some things. And then we push it out to the private sector across the EU. But it's pretty hard to have that dialogue if we can't have a sharing arrangement even with our own private sector folks here. And this is a private sector generated economy here when it comes to the internet. So our networks are privately sector run, protected, and driven. And I argue that's the right way to do it. That means we're going to have a uniquely American approach to this that protects privacy, protects civil liberties, and still protects our intellectual property and our national security interests as well. So we'll do that, do it with the Europeans, and then spread it out through G20. That's kind of our plan as we roll it out. And for any of the reporters here, you should grab the Estonians. They are ahead of the curve when it comes to cyber protection, mainly because they've lived through such a tough time on their own. And your ambassador is fantastic, and she should get everywhere she can, because when she shows up, she wins converts. She's really, really good. Yes. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Mike Weber. I'm from the Institute of World Politics here in Washington. I'm a native of Michigan, so it's great to see you're so interested in this subject. There was a DHS report that came out a couple days ago, and it was quoted in the Wall Street Journal talking about how the sequester might affect some of the cyber projects that are ongoing, especially scaling back conferences and other critical network infrastructure type activities. So how is the sequester?
The nays are 0. Two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the concurrent resolution is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that my name be removed as a co-sponsor of H.R. 1213.
Without objection.
Thank you.
The chair is prepared to entertain 1-minute requests. Purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania rise?
Mr. Speaker, request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend.
Without objection, the gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute. The House will be in order. Members will please take their conversations off the floor. The House will be in order. The gentleman may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week a group of more than 80 members of the House and Senate unveiled a package of legislative reforms to make government more efficient, effective, and less wasteful. The bipartisan group is called No Labels, encompassing members of Congress who have committed to meet on a regular basis to find common ground among political parties on a range of policy issues. Now, I reach across the aisle on every single piece of legislation I introduce. It's the only way to actually get something done in this town. But this group is looking to create a larger dialogue among members of Congress from different parties with different philosophies. It's a constructive group that is looking to advance solutions on a nonpartisan basis. The package of 9 bills they introduced last week might not solve all of the nation's problems, but they do demonstrate how common ground can be achieved, how Democrats and Republicans can work together as problem solvers. The more members that we can bring together to work across the aisle on a consistent basis helps us to build trust and ultimately a legislative branch that functions a whole lot better. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The House is not in order. Members will take their conversations off the floor. The House will be in order. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
I have spoken to my constituents who are concerned about the viability of Social Security. They want big ideas and long-term solutions. Instead, there are solutions right now and proposals to switch to a changed CPI formula to calculate cost of living adjustments for Social Security beneficiaries to save money. This would reduce benefits and only extend Social Security solvency for 2 years. I do not support the use of changed CPI. It reduces the amount of Social Security checks, but not the rising cost of health care, water bills, or other fixed costs that seniors continue to face. The importance of Social Security is evident in the lives of millions of beneficiaries, including my own father and grandmother. It's an earned benefit that these hard-working Americans have paid into their entire lives. That's why I have signed on to House Concurrent Resolution 34 to express my clear opposition to this misguided reduction in benefit. But I don't stand here to just knock down ideas. Instead of reducing benefits through changed CPI, I believe we should raise the cap on payroll contributions. Currently, Social Security taxes are only collected on the first $113,000 of earnings. By raising the cap, we can extend Social Security solvency without cutting benefits. I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing changed CPI, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from West Virginia seek recognition?
1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman from West Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, the House will consider 2 pieces of legislation that are vitally important to protect the jobs of thousands of West Virginians. I rise as a proud co-sponsor of the Coal Residuals Reuse and Management Act and the Energy Consumers Relief Act. The Coal Residuals Reuse and Management Act will stop the EPA from implementing new coal ash regulations by empowering the states to create a permit program that meets their individual needs. while still providing environmental safeguards. The EPA's proposed regulation on coal ash would cost thousands of jobs and would increase electric bills for families and small businesses. It would also hinder the reuse of coal residuals, guaranteeing that more coal ash would end up in landfills instead of reused as concrete or cement. The House will also consider the Energy Consumers Relief Act. This legislation requires that any time EPA proposes a regulation that would cost more than $1 billion, that it is to be reviewed by other agencies, including the Department of Energy. If the Secretary of Energy determines that a rule would have adverse effects on the economy, such as unemployment, wages, consumer prices, business and manufacturing activity, then the results must be made available to the Republic. Thousands of workers have been laid off. We've got to get back to creating jobs in this country, and these two bills will do that. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Although the House continues to ignore climate change, others are busy assessing the problems and options to address the new situations that this nation and our world will face in a warmer world. The United States Global Change Research Program's draft assessment suggests that we have work to do if we are to maintain a reliable, modern transportation system. The committee's draft states that sea level rise, storm surge, extreme weather events, heat waves, and other manifestations of climate change are reducing the reliability and the capacity of our transportation system in many ways. The good news is the negative impacts can be reduced through rerouting, mode change, and other adaptive actions if we invest in our transportation network. The states should not have to do this exercise alone. The federal government should lead the effort to deal and resolve climate change. We can improve our infrastructure, reduce the cost of natural disasters, and ensure that our transportation network serves our nation's needs well into the future, all while creating jobs. Let's stop denying reality. Let's address climate change. Let's move our nation and the world forward. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition? My apologies.
To address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I stand today to commend and congratulate the city of Maple Grove for becoming Minnesota's newest Beyond the Yellow Ribbon community. The combined efforts of Maple Grove, the people and businesses of its community, and the Minnesota National Guard have helped ensure that our military members and their families have a strong support structure at home in their community. Beyond the Yellow Ribbon is a unique program formed by the Minnesota National Guard to support the thousands of service members who have served Minnesota since 9/11. It provides resources and training to service members and their families before, during, and after their deployment, helping them find jobs and integrate back into their community. As a Yellow Ribbon city, Maple Grove has gone above and beyond in supporting our troops and delivering a compassionate attitude to the many men and women who serve this great country, ensuring that our military members, when they come home, they come all the way home. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to bring attention to the plight of Mahdi Abu Deeb. Abu Deeb is the founder of the Bahrain Teachers Association and was arrested after taking part in pro-democracy protests in 2011. For this so-called crime, he was tortured and sentenced to 5 years in prison by a military court. As a member of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, I call for the immediate release of Abu Deeb and all of the prisoners of conscience. Abu Deeb is a nonviolent activist imprisoned for his beliefs. His release would send a message that the Bahraini government cares about freedom, prosperity, and justice for all of its citizens. I thank my colleagues and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, government agencies have been keeping track of Americans' whereabouts by amassing databases of millions of our license plates by using license plate scanners. Unbeknown to Americans, government technology records our movement from the time we get in our car in the morning to every place we stop during the day to the time we drive home. Plus, this data can be stored indefinitely. This reminds me of the days when I was in the Soviet Union and saw how government spied on its citizens constantly. Do we really want a government to have the authority to record us anywhere we go during the day or during the night? We know by recent experience abusive government cannot be trusted with dragnet information data files it collects on Americans. To me, freedom includes government not keeping a personal daily log on individuals and their activities. None of these activities are the government's business. The right of privacy and the right to be left alone include the right to keep snooping government surveillance out of our lives. And that's just the way it is. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without further objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, I'm very concerned about the so-called zero option that was floated by the President. Hundreds of thousands have fought for a victory for the Afghan people, and on the eve of a victory for the Afghan people, the President is floating the option of no troops post-2014. I ask, is the Taliban cheering that discussion, or are they scared of it? I would say that they are cheering the idea of no U.S. troops. 60% of the Afghan people are under the age of 20. It is a new society. Mr. Speaker, I'm concerned that we're on the verge of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. I would call on the President to announce a smaller post-2014 force and send a message to the Taliban that we will not back down, and you will never rule Afghanistan again. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there further 1-minute requests? Chair lays before the House the following personal requests.
Leave of absence requested for Mr. Culberson of Texas for today.
Without objection, the request is granted. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2013, the gentlewoman from Alabama, Ms. Roby, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am so pleased to have the opportunity tonight to be here in this chamber with so many of our colleagues eager to discuss solutions for our country, solutions for our economy, and so I'm just going to invite my colleagues to participate in this conversation as they see fit. So, but Mr. Speaker, want to just point out to you that we have reached out to our constituents about this leadership hour tonight on Twitter using #4Jobs. And Mr. Speaker, we are hopeful that tonight during this hour we will continue that conversation, Mr. Speaker, with our constituents at #4Jobs. I've got a lot of comments from my constituents back home that I'm eager to share as we go along through this hour. But I wanted to start off by pointing out what many of you may have already read, and that was that the President has stated that he plans to pivot now once again back to jobs in the economy. And I thought, well, that's great news. That's what we've been pushing here. Many of you have seen us carrying around our cards, our laminated cards that talk about all the jobs bills that we've passed in this Congress in the last, trying to promote economic growth in this country to help get hardworking, taxpaying Americans back to work. But I lost my enthusiasm when buried in that article was the President's statement, and it was this. White House, quote, White House officials said 3 speeches will not offer new proposals or approaches. So we're going to pivot back to jobs in the economy, but we have no new approaches and we have no new ideas. And that to me is a pivoting of message and not a pivoting of policy. We're watching, all of us have stories of going back home to our district and meeting with American families that continue to struggle. And this rhetoric that we all feel is not helping the reality of the situation of the people that we were sent here to represent. So we're not losing faith, or the American people aren't losing faith because the President's message isn't working, they're losing faith because his policies aren't working. And I'm the first to say we've got to quit doing a lot of this pointing fingers. So I'm hopeful that tonight in this conversation, and I have some solutions that I'd like to put out there. You can't criticize without coming behind it and offering a solution. We've done that continuously in this House, Mr. Speaker, and we'll continue to do so.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentlelady from Alabama for organizing this, and it's great to be joined with you on this very important subject, the idea of, you know, over 7.5% of our fellow neighbors. Illinois, by the way, the President's home state of Illinois, it's higher than 7.5%. You can see in Illinois, if you want to see what big government's going to eventually do, just take a look in my home state. You're going to see people that are desperately searching for work, that wake up every day just wondering if they're going to get a paycheck, and then if they have a job, they're wondering, is this the last day? Am I going to go into work today and get that pink slip? Am I going to go into work today and have to come home and tell my wife or tell my husband or tell my kids that we're going to have to tighten the belt because dad or mom just lost their job? Illinois has been hit very hard. And the reason Illinois has been hit very hard is it's not because it's cold. It is cold in Illinois sometimes in the winter. My friend from Colorado can talk about that too. It's not because it's flat, although parts of Illinois are very flat. Illinois, in fact, used to be, and still maintains some edge, but used to be the powerhouse for manufacturing in the country. But we've seen a disappearing manufacturing. In the bipartisan spirit of not trying to point too many fingers, I'll say that's happened under all administrations where we've seen manufacturing leave. But the one difference between Illinois and what we've seen and the states that surround us is a big, stifling, bloated, bureaucratic government. A government that is so big it takes away the opportunity for the free market to breathe. Now, Mr. Speaker, I understand, and I'll be the first to admit that my party, the Republican Party, has not done a great job always of messaging. I think that's an understatement of the century. Sometimes we get absorbed in the idea of numbers, and we talk about what it means to balance the budget, but we don't explain why we want to balance the budget. We talk about jobs, and sometimes we let our colleagues on the other side of the aisle talk about the middle class and the lower income. You know, Mr. Speaker, my father ran a homeless shelter, and he did this for a couple of decades. I was raised in an environment to understand what conservatism and how that works with those that are homeless and down and out. My mom's a public school teacher. I understand the importance of public education in our society. And I understand that I became a Republican because I believe that a kid born in inner city Chicago, just 40 or 50 minutes from my house, should have the same opportunity as a kid born in Channahon, Illinois, where I live, or Inverness, Illinois, a wealthy suburban district, or wealthy suburban suburb, should have every opportunity to find personal achievement, to get an education, to be successful. I look forward to having this conversation and talking about the fact that there is a compassion for those that need help, and the fact that too many people are out of work today. I know my colleague from Colorado, Mr. Gardner, would like to say some, so I'll yield to you, sir.
Well, I thank my colleague from Illinois, the gentlelady from Alabama, for her leadership on the economy and those things that we truly need to get under control in this country in order to build better lives for our families and families across this nation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the time tonight. And I noticed the gentleman from Illinois did say that his district was flat. Now, I think it surprises a lot of people when I say, look, I represent the second largest geographic area in the state of Colorado in Congress, and most of my district is flat as well. So I understand what the gentleman is talking about when it comes to vast areas of great flat land in the high plains of Colorado. When we got elected in 2010, I think most of us, the three of us here tonight, and we may be joined by others tonight, who all got elected in 2010 because we wanted to find a way to make America work again, to empower people around this country, whether it was the inner cities of our biggest areas to people in rural areas across Colorado in this nation. Empower them to build the life that they always wanted to pursue their dreams, to make sure that the American spirit is alive and well. And I think most of us recognize that we do that when we give people the powers to do that for themselves, to get government out of the way and let America work, to tear down regulations that prevent job creation, to help make sure that access to capital is easier, not more difficult, that energy is more affordable, not more costly. And over the past couple of years, we have pursued policies to do just that. In fact, this upcoming week, we will be voting on legislation to make sure that energy policies don't drive up the cost that it takes to power our economy, but it actually makes sure that we have a safeguard over regulations that cost too much, to make sure the Department of Energy is paying attention to what's happening at the EPA in terms of regulations. We've passed legislation to make it easier for people in small dollar amounts to loan money to their neighbors, to their friends, to invest in businesses that they're excited about, to try to tear down hurdles to invest at the individual level. You don't need a stockbroker down on Wall Street to figure out how to get involved in the American economy. We've passed legislation that allows individuals to get involved at the very startup level of companies, innovation entrepreneurs around this country. And we did it because we know that there's people with incredible ideas of how to create opportunity, incredible ideas of how to create new wealth where none existed before. In my district, whether it's agriculture, whether it's energy, whether it's high tech, entrepreneurs are leading this nation. And I know the gentlelady from Alabama and Illinois has similar experiences. And so we talk tonight about what we can do for this country, what we have done for this country. Legislation that's coming up, we'll be introducing more. But we'll also be talking about the impediments we have to a healthy and a full economic recovery, and that's the President's plan. And while the President talks a lot about the economy, and I hear that he's going to be talking once again about the economy, unfortunately, his actions haven't matched up, and the people of this country are still suffering.
And like I mentioned at the beginning, buried in that article was that when the President gives these 3 speeches over the course of the next few days, there will be no new approaches or ideas. And I also said that we can't stand here and criticize without offering our own recommendations about how we can do this better and how we feel like we have done it better and offered real solutions for hardworking Americans. And I wanted to compare some of the things that we've done with what I'm hearing directly from my constituents. And Mr. Speaker, tonight specifically we wanted to communicate with our constituents using hashtag the number 4 jobs. And these are some of the comments that we've gotten. Chris Ray from Prattville, Alabama says no business is going to risk hiring full-time employees like they did in the past because they will have to provide health care due to Obamacare. Change that and address the widening skill gap, and I think businesses will begin to hire en masse. So it's a regulation problem and an education problem, in my opinion. That's from Chris Ray from Prattville. Well, let's look at our approach and how that matches up with the concerns of our constituents. We need to, instead of pivoting back to no new ideas, because we've remained focused on jobs and the economy, let's pivot away from Obamacare to patient-centered health care that actually improves health care, brings down the cost, takes a market approach to help straining families and make it harder, this health care law making it harder for small businesses to hire. A health care system that ensures that when you're sick, you and your doctor are the ones that are in the driver's seat of making the decisions. And then to address Mr. Ray from Prattville, Alabama's concerns about overburdensome regulations. We want to pivot, again, back to all of these bills that we've offered that ease burdensome regulations so that businesses are free to expand and invest and hire so more people have good jobs. Okay, so what regulations? All of us, I mean, I could look at any one of you and you could say, Keystone Pipeline, the hindrance of allowing that to move forward, replacements to the health care law. I had a bill, the Working Family Flexibility Act, that amended part of the Fair Labor Standards Act, a 70-year-old restriction that doesn't allow compensatory time in lieu of cash payments for overtime in the private sector, which would help these very Americans that we're talking about, providing flexibility in the workforce. And all of the uncertainty that we see. I mean, we've stood on this floor many nights like this talking about testimonials that we've heard directly from business owners. And it just never ceases to amaze me that we're having these discussions here, but we're all about to go home in August. And I would love to hear from even our colleagues on the other side of the aisle about what they're hearing from their businesses. Do they feel certainty? Do they feel like they can ramp things up and hire more people in this uncertain environment with all of this overburdensome regulation that we're trying so hard to ease so more Americans can have jobs?
And I just would like to add to that. So, you know, we talk about regulations, and I know, look, the vast majority of Americans, myself included, are not small business owners. And so the vast majority of Americans can listen to this and say, I understand in theory what's being said, but it's not something I necessarily feel. So let me just put it, let's try to put this in a way that I think a lot of people can relate to. If you're looking at buying a house, now you have a big decision to make. You're ready to buy a new house. You've got a family you're providing for. You know what your budget is, what you can afford on a mortgage. You know what you can afford for your property taxes. But let's say there's a lot of government uncertainty out there. Let's say, first off, you may not have a job in 6 months because of this economy. You may be saying, boy, I just don't know what my cash flow is going to be like, and I don't know if it's going to be there. Well, let's relate that to the bigger economy. These companies don't necessarily know what is going to be brought and put before them by Washington, D.C., what it's going to cost them. Let's say your local government was threatening to raise property taxes in a major way. Well, now that comes into play. Let's say there was a threat of losing your home mortgage interest deduction. And so as you put that into play and you're trying to decide, do I buy this house? Now that's a threat. And you watch a television, and all over the television the idea is homes are collapsing in value. We remember that from a few years ago. That's uncertainty. That's the kind of uncertainty that everyday Americans feel. The kind of uncertainty that you wake up sometimes in a cold sweat because you don't necessarily know what the next month is going to look like. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's our point, is take that uncertainty that an individual feels, but now put that on a bigger level of a business owner. A business owner who sometimes is the last person to get paid because they sign everybody else's paycheck first. And sometimes these small business owners are literally in tears at night. They're in bed. They don't know whether they can make payroll. They know they have 5 or 10 people that are relying on them to provide that paycheck because they have families too. That's a lot of pressure. So we're not talking about making businesses not pay taxes. We're not talking about getting rid of all regulations and letting this be the Wild West of business. But we're talking about creating a level of certainty that these businesses can plan and they can begin to know what they can do and take a deep breath and create jobs.
I want to share something that I posted on Facebook last week, and it was an